This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Welcome to the Human Coin podcast. This is episode 2 of my interview with Claire O'Donnell, formerly with the International Budget Partnership and a professional working in gender equality and gender responsive budgeting, and with Marija Risteska, the Executive Director of the Center for Research and Policymaking in Macedonia and the Regional Director of the Gender Budget Watchdog Network in the Western Balkans and Moldova. And the interview is on the publication put out by the International Budget Partnership entitled Addressing Gender Responsive Budget Implementation, How Civil Society is Holding Governments Accountable to Gender Promises in Budget Execution. So now back to our interview. I'd like to get your sense of what you see as the state of gender responsive budgeting, because I think what I hear from you, Marija, and having said, I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I did an assessment of gender responsive budgeting in Kosovo last year. And so, when you talk about the issue of roads or being of roads, I had that specific conversation in Kosovo in different ministries where there's very much, okay, roads are for everyone. No need to do any gender responsive budgeting on that. But sanitary napkins in schools, of course, that's a women's activity. Therefore, we're going to focus on that. And really a lack of understanding of even why this is necessary on a broader, more integrated stage. Give us a bit of context. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going on long here, but I guess the other thing I want to add is it sounds like partly the reason you're focusing so much on the stories of the people, not to say that shouldn't be the case, but with the lack of gender disaggregated data in the region, as opposed to waiting for government to take action, you're trying to mobilize people to talk about how their experience fits into that overall picture. Apologies for the long explanation or contribution, but what are your views on all of that?
Well, I would agree that actually it is a decision to fill in the gap that is existing. We live in a region which is at different stages of development. In some countries of the region, we have very well developed program budgeting, which has been implemented, and there have been results defined. Some of the countries are very well advanced in defining also gender indicators that are linked to those results framework. In other countries, we have line budgeting, and which is not so much result-oriented, so it's very difficult to track whether the results are being met and whether and to measure through indicators whether who is the beneficiary of these implemented measures through the budgets. So yes, civil society is filling that gap of not having sex disaggregated data and not having also capacity of the governments to analyze from a gender perspective the needs of the citizens and how the measures that they are adopting and implementing are addressing the different needs. But in the same time, this I think is an opportunity for civil society, because we are still countries which are not so democratically developed, and we are practicing these democratic tools of having gender budget initiatives, advocate for them being adopted. And then, of course, being in a role of a watchdog of the implementation of those gender budget initiatives, whether they are successfully implemented, whether they need to be improved, their design to be improved and or changed with a new measures. I would say that we have a lot of stories like this in Argentina. For example, one of the first things that we have did in Macedonia as Center for Research and Policy Making, we analyzed one budget line on sports and youth back in 2007. Where the government put a lot of money into building football pitches. They had a plan to build 50 or 80 football pitches, and we analyzed who would be the beneficiary of these football pitches with the money that they have allocated. And of course, we looked at the usual suspects. These are the football clubs who would be direct beneficiaries of the infrastructure that is being built. And in Macedonia, unfortunately, there are only only 12 football teams that are women's football teams. So 99% of the beneficiaries of this investment would have been men. What we decided to do was to calculate how much it will, how many actually multi-purpose sport halls would be built with the same amount of money that they were putting aside to build these football pitches, so that we can actually demonstrate how access to the sports and youth money would be more equal if they have opted for another measure where both women and men could be beneficiaries equally. Because the multi-purpose sport halls would have been used for different sports, professionally and non-professionally, and this would allow a more balanced access to the resources that were put in place for achieving this goal of, I don't know, developing sport activities and among youth. With the same amount of money. So it turned out that they could build 150 sport halls with the same amount of money and reaching more than around million people. And the calculation for the football teams were around 30,000 people that would be direct beneficiaries of the football pitches. So we've advocated for a change of this measure and financing actually sport halls. The result was a success. Actually, the government saw that they would actually increase trust in their decision to finance sport halls if they invest in sport halls rather than in football pitches. So they adopted our gender budget initiative, and for the next 8 years, they were building sport halls. Which was one of the flagship actually projects of one of the governments we had here. But we actually increased the sport infrastructure and the inclusion of women in sports, and this could be seen from different statistics and indicators that we have gathered in the country. Yes, we can have we can have specific measures that are targeting women, and I can give you another example of a sports example of how you specifically can target women. But you can have a rather gender responsive measure that not specifically targets women, but has an impact on the equal access of women and girls to the resources that are put in place with the budget.
And I just want to pose a question on, that's fascinating. I just want to pose a question on that, because the reality is that if you had the opportunity, I'm sure you would want to conduct that analysis at the formulation phase of the budget, or even at the approval phase of the budget. But the reality is that if the government is not conducting that gender impact analysis at the formulation phase to look at the effect of its policies and programs on women and marginalized population groups, then essentially it forces you to wait until the budget figures are out and to sort of do it in the middle of the budget process, which means that you have no choice but to do it that way. But that also means that it takes government longer to react, right? If they develop those systems, eventually develop those systems themselves, that could be helpful for having that conducted sooner in the budget process, if that makes sense. In other words, if they were conducting their own gender and impact analysis. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, exactly. This ex ante analysis is crucial, and countries that have systematically included gender responsive budgeting in their public finance management systems usually have this ex ante analysis included. Macedonia has done that, and it is in the form of gender budget statement of the ministries that are proposing the budget programs to be included into the state budget. It will be functional in 2025 because the law has been adopted, but the implementation of the law has been
yes, of course, it takes time.
Pushed for 2025. But I think here also civil society role is important because they can contribute with the gender budget initiatives to be included into the budget. But this budget initiative should have ex ante analysis, of course. But also, I think here I would go back to your argument of the importance of the parliament. I think that the parliament has also a role, very crucial role in ex ante analysis. By producing through the budgetary offices this type of analysis for the budget proposal that is being presented to the parliament for adoption, and including these arguments of what will be the impact of this proposed budget on different groups in society during the process of adoption of the budget. Unfortunately, in countries like the ones where we operate in the region, where the democratic capacity is not so developed, the budget debates are not so long. Last year, for example, in Moldova, the budget was adopted overnight without any discussion. So you don't have actually the period of discussing the budget in the different committees from different perspectives. The different vulnerabilities are not being taken in consideration, so that you cannot really, even if you have ex ante analysis, you cannot really include it into the debate and have with that an impact on the decision itself. I don't know, Bosnia, for example, is still operating on a budget from last year because they didn't have political consensus to adopt a new budget, and so on. So it is a difficult argument to give that ex ante analysis is crucial, and the Parliament has a role here in countries like the ones in the region, but this is what we strive for.
Right, and I think Claire, we'll come over to you to get your reaction to those comments. But I think on the ex ante analysis, certainly parliamentarians could have some assurance that if there is that ex ante gender impact analysis in place, that it means that policies are more well thought out with regard to their impact on women and marginalized population groups. However, I totally agree with you that the opportunity for debate is simply not there. And I think, I just came from Malawi a couple of weeks ago, where they've got 2 weeks to analyze the budgeting committee and 1 week to debate it, which sounds like a lot if you compare it to what you just mentioned in the Moldovan situation, right? But there's barely time to discuss the budget, let alone adopt that gender lens. And so I think you're right. I think that's just another argument we can add to the list of why Parliament's role in when it comes to the approval phase of the budget really needs to be expanded, and why Parliament also needs to have a stronger role in the formulation phase when the real conversations are taking place about how to develop the budget on the part of the executive branch. Claire, any thoughts on that?
Totally. I think part of the reason that partnerships and coalitions are so important is because there are organizations like Marija's Gender Budget Watchdog Network that have such a breadth of knowledge in working in so many different kinds of budget contexts, right? As you were saying, like the level of which gender responsive budgeting is adopted or is understood varies greatly. And I think especially when there is this gender responsive budgeting or just is such a big hurdle sometimes, and especially for organizations that maybe don't have as much experience in working in this. I think there's so much to be learned from those that are and those that have been tracking the different kinds of ways and learning from I think the Gender Budget Watchdog Network is such a great way to bring together minds that have different experiences, and there's a lot to be learned from the experiences of others, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And I think it makes it much less intimidating than starting at zero. So I think that it's been such a great experience to get to learn from the experiences of organizations in the network and seeing how those can be applied in different contexts and what conversations we can bring them into and be a part of has been really, really rewarding.
That's
If I
amazing.
can
And
contribute,
yes, go ahead,
I
Maria. Yes,
think
of
the
course.
power of a network is very important, and being in a partnership. So we have benefited greatly being part of the IBP, learning from different resources and excellent knowledge management they have across the world. But in the same time, we have seen being part of the Gender Budget Watchdog Network, what is the power of the network? Because, for example, one organization in Macedonia has developed methodology on assessing the menstrual poverty in the country. And through the network, this methodology was transferred in Kosovo, in, for example, Bosnia, in Serbia. And now the whole region is not just assessing what is the extent of menstrual poverty, but through the network, we've done regional advocacy for the decrease of the VAT tax on menstrual products, which was already successful in Macedonia, in Montenegro, and partially in Bosnia, because in Bosnia we cannot really decrease. There is only one rate on VAT. But, for example, one other measure that we also advocated for, which is free menstrual products to be provided for schoolgirls, was adopted in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this campaign is ongoing now in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Albania, and I hope that by end of the year, the whole region will adopt some of the measures that we advocated for. So the being networked, exchanging these experiences and working together, especially in a neatly tied region like the Western Balkans, has its benefits and amplifies the results of the individual organizations using gender responsive budgeting tools.
That's amazing. And I think what really inspires me is, when I'm working in a country with the executive branch on gender responsive budgeting, my brain is sort of operating on the premise that, well, they've got to get their systems in place and then we'll have just gender responsive budgeting. But then, if civil society is not waiting around for that to happen, but they're pushing all the levers and making sure that they're not depending on the executive branch, but rather having those conversations and being proactive, I think that's truly, truly amazing. Yeah, for sure. It's very inspiring. Marija, in the time we have left, do you want to talk a bit about what happened in the case of Mexico, where there you've got a situation where there is some gender responsive budgeting capacity in place, specifically tracking, which we know, tagging is such a buzzword. I mean, we can always talk about tagging, and everybody sort of has a general idea of what that means. But yet we saw in the case study in the publication when it came to Mexico that could also be manipulated and not always helpful in terms of understanding the actual number of programs and budget of programs that actually do benefit women and marginalized groups. Can you talk a bit about that?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds okay. Okay.
Did I say Marija instead of Claire? Did I? Is that what
Yeah,
I
no
did?
worries.
Sorry about that. I meant Claire. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. No worries. But yeah, I agree. I think the Mexican case is very interesting as it highlights that even when governments have systems in place for tagging and tracking gender elements in the budget, it's still important for civil society to follow up to ensure that they're being used for their intended purposes. So our partner Fundar is a Mexican CSO that conducts research and advocacy on topics that include fiscal justice, human rights, anti-corruption, and gender. And for this piece, I spoke with Andrea Larios, who does a lot of work on this topic, and she found that the government was tagging programs without clear gender components as programs that aim to narrow gender gaps. And the big concern that she highlights is that the government is externally saying that they're very committed to gender and that they're continuing to increase funding. Like, look at this. There's called Annex 13 in the Mexican government that tags all spending that seem to have a gender component. And they're like, look, this fund has been increasing and continuing to increase. But what Andrea found was that it's happening when what is increasing is just programs being tagged as gender, which are majority universal social programs. While if you look at programs, for example, that are targeted for the prevention of violence against women, those ones are losing funding, or funding also after allocation are being redistributed elsewhere and they don't have enough funds to operate. So I think it's really interesting because it does highlight the importance of understanding the tagging system, not just having the boxes checked, but really being able to see the role of civil society and analyzing and understanding where the focus is being given, right? Because the government's real commitment is seen through what it is funding, not what it is saying it is funding, right? So when government funds are not delivered as promised, civil society has such an important role to bring this data and use it in advocacy. And I think it is such an interesting case where you see this disconnect between what the government is saying it is committed to and what, when you actually look at the budget lines, what is being funded and what isn't being funded. And I know that that's something that's really important to Fundar. And one thing that I think is slightly different is she has, Andrea talked about some of the frustration she's had because it's not as much a part of public discourse as in the Argentinian case, right? So getting the kind of public outcry is lacking a little bit in the Mexican case behind these budget numbers as compared to the Argentinian one. But I know it's something that they're still pushing and trying to call attention to and get funds to go more towards programs that have a focus on gender. And I think, again, this connects to Maria, as you said, how there are so many different systems and levels of understanding of gender tagging systems and how much work there is also, or role that civil society can play when they have maybe more expertise. Or I know, Maria, you also do a lot of work with capacity building in regards to gender responsive budgeting. And they also have this really great methodology for gender budget watchdog reports that do monitor the implementation with regards to gender. And so I think, as both Argentina and Mexico show, the role of civil society to analyze the gender tagging system, because it can always be improved, is something that I think a lot of other organizations could learn from and model.
Actually, it's what is also needed is maybe a world coalition of NGOs that would contribute to the improvement of the international system of tracking gender financing for gender equality. And I think it's a very good opportunity that we unite before the next CSW, which is focused on poverty, but it also has an aspect on financing for gender equality. So maybe starting the discussion there at the UN on the Commission of the Status of Women on how we are tracking financing for gender equality is the right place to start, because we kind of focused on the tracking systems as a checklist, and without really looking at the gender responsive budgeting as a policy tool, which provides for which focuses on the impact actually of the financing for gender equality, what it is bringing for the status of women, whether it is improving this financing for gender equality, the status of women, and overall gender equality, or we are just tracking how much money we have put on, which is gender relevant, but it's not really having an impact on the status of women.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I think we could continue this conversation for the rest of the day, because what you've just, and I know it's my job to keep us on track, so we will have to wrap up shortly, but in terms of what you've just said, I think what would be fascinating, and you may already have done this, is to have civil society look at the PIFA, Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Frameworks, Gender Responsive Public Financial Management Annex at the methodology, and say, okay, this is a great start, but how do we add more meat in the pie? And I suspect you've already, based on your comments, I suspect that you've already started to think about
We've done that. What we are asking for, actually, that international organizations that are promoting PIFA to be implemented by national governments, that should use the PIFA framework also for their own funding, because they manage a lot of money, which is very important for international development, but also national development. So how they are actually planning the money from a gender perspective, what are their promises and results?
Oh, are you saying practice what you preach?
They are impacting with the money they manage also.
Are you saying practice what you preach?
Yeah.
Practice. Oh, sorry. We have to stop. We have to stop the interview now. Sorry. Just kidding. Just kidding. Well, I mean, and frankly, I mean, the IMF in particular is they just designed their gender mainstreaming strategy. I think they just released it last year, right? They are just light years behind, light years behind the comprehension. They've got a long way to go. So I totally understand where you're coming from. What would be, here's a wrap up question for you. What would be your message to governments in the region? As civil society organizations, what would you like to see change? Very difficult, very not one of the questions listed on the list here. So putting you on the spot a little bit.
I think that I truly believe in the power of gender responsive budgeting, and I think every politician would see the benefit in it. So I truly am expecting that more politicians would see that using these tools in the way how they govern are helping them get more trust from citizens, getting re-elected, being a better citizens of their countries, and cooperating with civil society on that way is the right way of doing budgeting and implementing the budget. I strongly believe that gender budgeting is good budgeting for the people, but also for the governments.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I just want to add that I don't think the sales job that has been done so far has really done GRB justice. And I think maybe the thought, certainly from a technocratic perspective, we've got some great ideas out there, but from the way that it is sold, I think it really there's a lot of we faced a lot of resistance, and partly you're right about helping politicians to understand the benefit of using these systems to attract more votes. For example, unfortunately, it's got to go down to their incentives. Claire, you're going to get the last word on this. What are your thoughts in terms of key messages for government?
I totally agree that it comes down to public trust and to more efficient budget systems in general, right? Having budgets that work for the people and get the services to the beneficiaries that are intended. The gender responsive budgeting is a way to improve the systems that are already in place for the promises that governments already make to have the proper follow through. I think there's a lot of work, as Marija said, incentives for them to have the trust of their populations and for populations to know that their needs are reflected in the budget should be a baseline, should be the goal, right? And I think that there is so much to learn and to see civil society not as the enemy, but instead as a source, as a resource for knowledge, for experience methodologies, understanding the needs and reality of the people when budgets are being formulated is so important. And it's so incredible to see all the bright minds that are contributing to this discussion and the amount of learning that governments have, that the amount of learning and knowledge that is available in the civil space of civil society that they could really benefit from.
And I think even in the work that I do here in Canada, I still see in some cases, at the provincial and territorial level, this idea that we're the government and you're civil society. There still is not the conception that we're, it's all should be all part of one process. Marija Risteska and Claire O'Donnell, thank you so much for taking the time today to have this conversation. If you read the title of the document, it sounds fascinating, but I think our conversation has really gone above and beyond and illuminated so many other important areas. So I want to thank you both very much for your hard work on this and for your time. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Likewise.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.